Good morning, friends, and welcome to the Biblical Perspective for Saturday, September the 18th, 2021. Grab a good cup of coffee and let's see what the Word of God might have to say about what's going on in our nation and in our world. Good coffee this morning, and I need it. I'm on my second cup already. I want to share with you today some things in response to even what we shared last week as we're right here just past the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I'm going to put some things in biblical perspective. I'll be reading a couple of articles for you today that probably are from some sources you would not normally see. But I want to begin from Deuteronomy chapter 11. Yeah, I want to get in the Old Testament just a little bit because there's a pattern laid out all the way through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. It's repeated in the history of Israel. That is what God promises based on the reaction of his own people. Chapter 11 of Deuteronomy, beginning in verse 26. Look, today I set before you a blessing and a curse. There will be a blessing if you obey the commands of the Lord your God I'm giving you today, and a curse if you do not obey the commands of the Lord your God and you turn aside from the path I command you today by following other gods that you have not known. Now, some of you might be saying, now, wait a minute, preacher, there you go again. Don't be applying things that only apply to Israel to nations like the United States. Friends, I don't think God's giving us a pattern that is only about one nation. I think he's giving us a pattern of the blessing and curse that any group of people can follow. It's something that Christian communities and Christian countries have understood for centuries. And so because of that, I want you to grasp, I think, what is the answer to why we are failing over and over again on the world stage and failing in our own country, why there's such dissension and division, and why we are collapsing. Now, some of you are having a hard time with this because you bought into a philosophy years ago that basically said, oh, America's God's nation here, and there won't be any problems with America until after the rapture. See, when all of us good Christians are gone, that's when it'll fall apart. You didn't realize what a tiny minority we seem to be. When I say we, I mean the Christians that actually have a clue and seem to care and participate in this nation at all. It seems as if we don't have a powerful enough voice to even maintain our own freedoms. So, friends, if you're being a little disillusioned nowadays, it doesn't mean that Jesus is late. It's just that you haven't realized how bad it would get before Jesus comes. I think when John, at the end of the book of Revelation, writes those beautiful words, even so, Lord Jesus, come, I think part of his hint was that before Jesus comes, some of us are going to be just overwhelmed with the heartbreak of what's happening in our world, and in our case, in our particular country. And we're going to be saying, Jesus, there's only one way to solve this mess. We can't do it through our politics and our ideology and our philosophy anymore. Jesus, you must come. And I think that longing of the heart of believers is one of the keys to the return of Jesus Christ and the rapture of his church. But having said all of that, I want you to understand that this week we received some of the, again, most wicked, terrible, bad news we've had in a long time. We were told at the end of August that we had accomplished a great strike. The new enemy, ISIS-K, had received a severe blow from a drone strike as we Americans had killed an ISIS planner. We didn't have a name of that person, but we were assured by the Pentagon that we had done the right thing. All our intelligence was correct, and we had destroyed this vehicle with one of these ISIS planners in it. And everybody went, yay, thank you for responding. Even as people are dying and we're leaving Afghanistan, at least we had something to cheer, right? We discovered this week, as one of our own generals got in front of the cameras, that all the suspicions many of the reporters had kept bringing to our leaders and kept questioning them over, well, what vehicle? Well, who were all these other people? What was this collateral damage? What was actually destroyed? Can't you give us some details? And we found out, no, they couldn't. The reason they couldn't give us the details is it was another bungled mistake. Yes, that little white Toyota that was destroyed was not an ISIS planning vehicle. It was actually a foreign aid worker. And not only was that person killed, but so were several children. And what was blown up in that vehicle were bottles of water for the most part and other aid supplies. What a bungled mess. What a mistake in the minds of our folks. Listen, this is the kind of thing that should be getting someone fired, yet no heads are rolling in our government as the ineptitude only grows. And as we look at this, what can be said of it? Listen, there are a couple of voices I want you to hear from this morning that I think put this in perspective. One you probably wouldn't listen to, but there's a guy out of Great Britain named Neil Oliver. He does GB News out of the UK. And he had such a stirring and moving op piece after the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I want to share some of that with you. I'm not going to quote so much directly as I'm going to paraphrase some of what he said. You can chase him down on YouTube and other networks when you have a chance. He called it the 20 years later video, and he recounted his experience of watching 9/11 take place as he was in Scotland at the time. And he said, now this is a quote, it was too much to take it. It was too much to take it. In other words, he was over there in another country, yet watching the Twin Towers collapse and seeing what was happening in America at 9/11 was too much for a person who loves the free world to actually ingest. He went on to describe some things. I want you to listen to what he says. Again, a little bit of paraphrase of some of his words. Can't give you all of them, but I want to give you the basic gist. He said, World War I was described as a set of iron railings in history. You could look back to see the way it was before, but it would never be the same. We could look at the old world, but there was no going back. The destruction of the Twin Towers was like that. A page turned, a change that was irreversible. I believe the United States of America is the best idea for a nation ever. But he went on to say the idea of America has not been fully realized. And that's what a lot of people around the world have said. America's the best idea. Why does everybody want to come here? Because they felt like we were the best place to come for so long. Now, all of a sudden, that's changing. It's turning away. In fact, turning away from our country are now millions of Americans who are choosing to live elsewhere, some choosing to renounce their citizenship to get out of our country. Well, that's another story. Let me get back to Neil's article. He says now, 20 years after the attack on the Twin Towers, the Taliban is declaring victory. 20 years after 9/11, and look at us. The Taliban, a bunch of murderous thugs from a medieval past, has won. We all had the clocks, they told us once, but they had all the time. While some of us in the West were fretting about pronouns and privilege and were being made to feel shame about the color of our skin and censoring ourselves rather than telling the truth, murderers with no such concerns were getting ready to be winners and take all. For a year and a half, we've lived as if nothing matters but a virus. We stopped our world dead in its tracks and went into our houses and hid as if there was nothing to fear in the world except the chance of getting ill. The vast majority of people who catch COVID get over it with little difficulty. By the way, that's not to discount those who don't. You and I all know someone who's either suffered gravely from COVID or lost their life because of it. But that can also be said of many other illnesses and diseases. Do we shut down our lives when that happens? All right, back to his article. He said, and because of this, we've stood by while our governments have taken our Western world apart piece by piece. With every passing day, it gets harder to deny the fact that our world is being dismantled deliberately by those who want to see it gone forever. What will replace it? He talks then about what's happening in some of our Western countries that you'll recognize readily. Back to the article. He says Boris Johnson not only taking away our freedoms, but our cars and our gas boilers as well, along with any appetite for foreign holidays or the freedom to go on a nightclub or a gig without being harassed by those demanding papers. In Australia, they've been firing rubber bullets and pepper spray at those who won't lie down and roll over. They've built quarantine camps. French government's playing the same game. In Canada, Justin Trudeau is paying businesses to close the door on unvaccinated patrons. In the United States, President Biden is making law to force people to take jabs or lose their jobs. Some service personnel, highly trained soldiers, pilots, medical professionals are now walking away from their careers instead. All of this in a world where we were raised to cherish freedom above all and pay homage every year to those who died for it. Vaccine passports over my dead body, he said. Meanwhile, Taliban 2.0 is looking just like the original Mark, and I'm willing to bet completely unvaxxed and unmasked and care nothing about social distancing. They're riding around in American Humvees as free as the birds. America's withdrawal from Afghanistan looks like another iron wall dropped into history. It was hard to watch planes taking off from Kabul with the tiny figures falling from them and not have flashbacks to 9/11 and the tiny figures falling from those twin towers. It was also impossible to forget the soldiers sent from Great Britain, America, and elsewhere to defeat those who had made it all happen. What on heaven or earth do the families of those soldiers who were wounded or died in the effort say to themselves now? How can our politicians look them in the eye? If we don't wake up, it might shortly be over for the West. Those are comments, not all of his comments from that particular uh, YouTube video that you can find out there for yourself, but some of the most powerful ones. Wow, what strong words. Let me shift to another writer now. That is Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch. He was quoted on a website that, again, not a lot of people like to look at because it's all bad news. TheReligionOfPeace.com. It's not about peace, it's about that moniker that's used to describe Islam, which is no religion of peace after all. It's a religion that has spawned violent jihadis now for generations, and yet we wonder why this takes place. When I ask the question to some people, how many terrorist incidents have we had that are deadly, that have actually killed people since 9/11? And I'll have people say, well, what, maybe a few dozen, and well, maybe 100, maybe a couple hundred, maybe. And folks will not recognize what I'm saying. I'll say, wait a minute, how about in all the world, not just America? Oh, well, maybe would that be 300? I don't know. And listen, nowhere have I asked that question where people got close to the number. But if you want to see the number, it's posted on the religionofpeace.com. They have kept track of this through the years since 9/11. And every one of these terrorist attacks have to be terrorist attacks where someone has actually perished, someone died in the attack, not the bungled ones where no one was killed or they were caught beforehand. And right now, on that scoreboard, I guess you would call it, on the religionofpeace.com, it'll say Islamic terrorists have carried out more than, and here's the counter. Are you ready? 40,040. That was as of yesterday. Over 40,000 deadly terror attacks since 9/11. Friends, do you grasp what that means? The world is actually at war, but doesn't recognize it, won't say that the war's been declared, won't fight against it as if it's a war. We just let people get slaughtered day in and day out by some of these jihadis that have so many different names now, we can hardly keep up with them. And we turn a blind eye as long as, well, my own little gated community or whatever is safe, then I don't have to worry about it. Matter of fact, in August of this year, each month you'll see on this website the reports of worldwide terror attacks and what they've amounted to. You say, well, maybe all those happened earlier in this century, right? How about August of this year, where there were some 220 attacks, 1,506 people killed, 1,331 injured, 5 suicide blasts, all this in some 23 different countries around the world, all in the name of Allah and his declaration that the world all needs to become Muslim. Now, I realize there are some of you, maybe even listening to me, that are more peaceful Muslims, and maybe you as a person who at least says you follow Islam, don't follow the more radical versions of it, but you've got to ask yourself the question, where does this stuff come from? These people who carry out these things say they're just following their leader, Muhammad, and they're doing what pleases Allah. Well, Robert Spencer writes an article entitled "The Taliban's Sharia Police Are Back," and they're mad. What did we just hand over Afghanistan to? Well, he writes, when the Taliban distributed their list of members of their new government, Biden's terminally naive and deluded State Department handlers were not happy. State Wonks issued a strongly worded statement Tuesday scolding the jihadis. Quote, we have made clear our expectation that the Afghan people deserve an inclusive government, end quote. Yeah, I'm sure they're shaking in their boots after that statement, aren't you? Back to the article. On what basis states experts have decided that what the Afghan people really deserve is a government that looks like Georgetown was not explained, but the statement went on to complain that the Taliban's new government consists exclusively of individuals who are members of the Taliban or their close associates and no women. And you're shocked by that, by the way. Okay, back to the article. And not only that, the Taliban have dropped the Ministry for Women's Affairs altogether, and they've replaced it with a feature of their first regime, the Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. What does that mean? Sharia law. That's what that means. A Kabul resident explained what's likely coming. People have stopped listening to loud music in public, fearing the past experiences from when the Taliban last ruled. They've already publicly murdered an artist who put videos out of music because that's just not virtuous, apparently. Hang on. I personally didn't see any forced prayers, the person goes on to say. But there is fear in everyone's minds. According to even the Washington Post, the last time the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, there were, quote, forces patrolling the streets, shutting down shops and markets at prayer time. They beat people that they caught listening to music and frowned upon dancing, kite flying, and American style haircuts. Squads of the ministry's morality police punished those who disobeyed their modesty codes with beards too thin or ankles that showed. They banished girls from school and women from the workplace and the public eye. A woman could not venture outside without a male guardian. Now, they call it propagation of virtue and prevention of vice. But what the Taliban are actually doing is reestablishing an empire of fear. This police force, which apparently entered the headquarters of an all-female orchestra and destroyed the instruments. Why? Because music is un-Islamic. They they don't really have anything to do with authentic virtue at all. Virtue involves choosing to do what is good because it is good out of love for God and or a conviction that it is right, no matter what the cost may be involved in choosing it. But by contrast, an empire of fear, such as what the Taliban are setting up today, people don't choose the good because it is good. They obey the dictates of those with the guns and the whips. They do so because they don't dare step out of line, not only out of an authentic understanding that the path of moral and ethical uprightness is preferable to the alternative, much less out of love for God, but because they are afraid of what would happen to them if they did depart from Islam's vision of morality. When people are unable to choose to do evil, their choosing of the good is merely a manifestation of fear and the power of coercion. And those who have no choice but to be good demonstrate nothing about whether their beliefs enable or inspire them to choose the good when they could just as easily not do so. And let me stop right there for a moment because, Robert, here's the whole point. What these new Sharia law captains are doing is nowhere near good. Okay. Now, Muslims and non Muslims often tell us, back to the article, by the way, that Muslims hate the West for its decadence, its immorality, its lasciviousness, which they contrast unfavorably with the supposed morality and uprightness of the Islamic world. Often this boils down to a Muslim critique of Western freedom, especially in the United States, which has pursued disastrously bungled and failed military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, ostensibly to bring some Western style freedom to those countries. Now, in line with that, the former Mufti of Australia once complained that, quote, Australian law guarantees freedoms up to a crazy level, end quote. He would likely have said the same rather about every Western country. Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini once thundered, quote, Whatever good there is exists thanks to the sword and in the shadow of the sword. People cannot be made obedient except with the sword. The sword is the key to paradise, which can be opened only for the holy warriors, end quote. That's comforting. Wouldn't you like to live under that guy? Look, this is not and never can be actual virtue, Robert goes on to write. It's just coercion. Genuine freedom is an indispensable prerequisite for any cultivation of real virtue. Well, the Taliban's ministry for the propagation of virtue and prevention of vice is the centerpiece now of their thuggish regime. Many foreign policy analysts in the West still nurse the fond hope that the Taliban is not popular among the Afghan people and they will throw it off and institute a more just and humane leadership, or that the Taliban will moderate in order to court popular favor. These analysts don't seem to realize that in a system based on coercion, popular approval is not required. Taliban do not consider that they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, but from Allah, and are determined to impose His law on the Afghan people. The sooner the state wonks drop their naive delusions and realize this and consider its implications, the better off we'll all be. But don't be holding your breath. I won't be, Robert, because we all know that right now we have a government that's so incapable of even operating its own country that God help us if it decides to stick its nose into the operation of any other countries. Friends, where does this put us? As you look at a map of that side of the world, from the Middle East to the Far East, you have to recognize, if you know the map of Ezekiel's coming war in Israel, that we're just paving the highway right now, getting ready for that war to take place. It's something that has taken place while we as Americans literally handed the Taliban the keys to the castle with enough munitions and military equipment to establish a gigantic army now that's nothing more than a terrorist army to be run out of Afghanistan. Who came up with this plan? Sounds like Satan himself. Friends, as we watch it play out, we've got to recognize something. Whether you kind of sit back and say, well, Craig, all of this does have a lot of prophetic implications and it has to be fulfilled, so why should we resist it? Friends, even if you know evil is going to conquer somehow, some way, it's up to those of us who know the difference between good and evil to fight for what is good and righteous and godly and resist the evil. Friends, those who were dying in the Roman Colosseums, being fed to the lions and being martyred for the cause of Christ, didn't say, well, now guys, listen, we know this crazy empire's got to be in control. Let's just back off with this faith. Let's just kind of go hide out. Let's don't practice it so publicly anymore. Let's save our own skins. Well, they're willing to say, when confronted with the idea of proclaiming allegiance to Caesar or to God, to say, Jesus is Lord, and then pay the consequences. Oh, friends, we not only have not been willing to pay the price, but now we are suffering, I think, what is going to be experienced of any nation, which on one hand has begged for God to bless them. Oh, God, just bless us. But yet in every avenue, we are rejecting God left and right, disobeying, murdering in his name. We are becoming the antithesis of the nation that God wanted us to be. And we cannot expect God to bless our exploits. Instead, he's going to take the entire opposite position. He's going to curse our exploits. You remember what he did to his own people, his own chosen people, when they got so far out of line that he had to let judgment fall on them. He took one of the wickedest societies ever, that from Babylon. Yes, that's right, over in that same region that we're talking about today. He took the Babylonians, those wicked Babylonians, and allowed them to conquer Jerusalem and take the people of God into captivity. Oh, friends, listen. God cannot be mocked. He's a jealous God. And when we turn our backs on him, especially when we have known him and his blessing, we cannot expect him to bless this mess. Well, I'm sorry I couldn't give you a more encouraging word today, but that's where we are, September the 18th, 2021. Will there be enough of a revival to turn back God's hand of judgment on America? I think we're too far gone, friends, but He can bless you. He can bless your community, your church, your people when you turn to God. So keep looking up, my friends. Jesus is coming. Let's put our hope, our trust in Him. God bless you. I'll see you next week. Every day as we wake up in His Word, and every Saturday on the Biblical Perspective.